Your Excellency Ambassador Wu Hongbo, Director of the UN DESA, Dr. Vishwati Dhar, and other members of the RIS, Excellencies, many of who are familiar faces and friends, distinguished guests. It is a pleasure to be here with you at this important conference on development cooperation. There has been an intensive dialogue in recent years involving governments, NGOs, and academia of both developed and developing countries on the conceptualization, delivery mechanisms, and evaluation of various forms of development assistance. Much of this dialogue has concentrated on bridging the divide between the North-South and the South-South engagements. Surprisingly, there is not quite as much vibrancy in exchanges of perspectives between developing countries, that is the countries of the South, on the impact of their development cooperation strategies and institutions, and on their own approach to the ongoing debate on the global development agenda. I welcome this opportunity to share with you our perspective on some of these issues, and we in the Ministry look forward to hearing from all of you over the next few days. In the last decade or so, the range and quantum of South-South cooperation has expanded significantly. This trend has paralleled disturbing signs of what could be described as a slackening of donor enthusiasm in the developed countries, particularly in the background of difficult global economic conditions. It has also inspired spirited multilateral discussions on harmonizing the traditional frameworks of North-South cooperation with the emerging patterns of South-South development partnerships. These discussions have focused on the evolution of universal norms for identification, delivery, and evaluation of all development assistance, whether North-South or South-South. They have raised important questions about values, motivations, and desirable outcomes. There is, however, a pervasive sentiment among countries of the South that they do not factor in sufficiently the underlying premises of South-South cooperation, the circumstances in which it developed, and its unique character. I will outline only India's experience, but to illustrate this point. From the time of our emergence as a free nation, we recognize the importance of human resource capacity building as a requirement for economic growth and independent policy making. This recognition informed the course of our cooperation with other developing countries with whom we shared the aspiration of eradicating poverty and underdevelopment. It was rightly mentioned that we had begun development assistance programs, particularly in our neighborhood, in the 50s, but this tended to be on a somewhat ad hoc basis. It was the Indian Technical and Economic Assistance Program, called ITEC, which was formally launched in 1964 with the objective of sharing our knowledge and skills with fellow developing countries, that really began the Indian program. Over nearly 5 decades, ITEC and its sister initiatives, the Special Commonwealth Assistance for Africa Program, SCOUT, and the Technical Cooperation Scheme of the Colombo Plan, have contributed substantially to capacity building in many parts of the world. Last year, to cite some figures, nearly 9,000 civilian training courses in diverse disciplines were conducted by 47 Indian institutions for candidates from 161 countries. We offer 2,300 scholarships annually for degree courses in Indian universities. In addition, we run special courses at the request of countries or regions on specialized subjects such as election management, WTO studies, parliamentary practices, and public-private partnerships. At the India-Africa Forum Summits, to which reference has been made, both in 2008 and 2011, we committed to establishing about 100 institutions in different African countries to strengthen capacities at the Pan-African, regional, and bilateral levels. we depute experts abroad to share expertise in areas like information technology, auditing, pharmacology, public administration, and textiles research. The core idea is to share the lessons we have learned and we continue to learn with other countries traversing the same path towards development. This is the spirit in which illiterate grandmothers from various countries are trained in a remote village in Rajasthan so that they can carry back solar electrification technologies to their remote villages in Africa, Central America, Asia, or the Pacific Islands. One of our best known NGOs, the SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, similarly contributes to women's empowerment in rural Afghanistan and in eastern Sri Lanka through livelihood generating programs. An earlier example is from our agricultural green revolution, when we shared with Vietnam our research on high-yielding rice varieties through exchanges of scientists and the establishment of a rice research institute in southern Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is a major rice exporter and in fact competes with India in world markets. In their structure and diversity, such programs do not have many parallels in the traditional North-South cooperation. Perhaps best tribute to their efficacy is the fact that a number of donor agencies and multilateral development organizations are now building such socio-economic development programs and training in Indian institutions into their own aid programs for countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. Over the years, we have considerably expanded our development cooperation portfolio through grant assistance to Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka for projects in infrastructure, hydroelectricity, power transmission, and other sectors identified by the host government as priority areas for their development. Another strand has been the concessional lines of credit. Over the last decade or so, over 150 lines of credit, totaling over US dollars 9.5 billion, have been allocated, financing a wide range of projects from drinking water schemes to power plants to technology parks and railway infrastructure in the developing countries in Africa and also elsewhere. In all these strands of development assistance, our underlying philosophy remains that which underpins South-South cooperation. Our engagement is demand-driven and responds to the developmental priorities of our partner countries. We do not attach conditionalities. We do not prescribe policies, and we do not challenge national sovereignty. We promote a mutually beneficial exchange of development experiences and resources. It is a well-established truism that South-South cooperation is on an entirely different footing from North-South cooperation in its inspiration, its implementation, and its impact. There is an acknowledged historical context to official development assistance, ODA, which distinguished North-South cooperation from South-South cooperation. The focus on South-South cooperation in the prevailing international discourse on aid architecture increasingly glosses over this distinction. It conveniently overlooks the reality that developing countries, even the so-called emerging countries, continue to confront major economic challenges of their own, and these have been exacerbated by the current global economic situation, which place an inherent limitation on their capacity to contribute to international development cooperation. The assistance which developing countries offer to other developing countries should therefore continue to remain voluntary and free from externally imposed norms drawn from the experience of North-South cooperation. Simply put, whereas North-South cooperation is a historic responsibility, South-South cooperation is a voluntary partnership. And I fully agree with His Excellency the Undersecretary when he said the title of our conference today should be really on Southern partners, not on providers. The fact that the traditional donor community often underplays the distinction between our forms of assistance does not diminish its validity. In the present global realities, it is self-evident that while South-South cooperation supplements North-South cooperation, it is not yet in a position to replace it in any significant measure. The North-South engagement leads the aid process and should continue to do so. The importance of ODA should not be allowed to be diluted. In fact, the present predicament of many developing countries facing contracting capital flows, economic slowdown, and fiscal difficulties makes their need for enhanced ODA even more critical than before. It is therefore a matter of great satisfaction that several donors have come forward to declare their continued commitment to the 1970 UN General Assembly pledge of achieving an ODA level of 0.7% of their GNP. Japan, Germany, Australia, and UK have targeted attainment of this goal by 2015. These are perspectives that should continue to feed into the important ongoing discussions on the post-2015 development agenda, which seek to identify the key international development priorities and to define a template for global cooperation in the coming decade and beyond. We should resist excessive emphasis being placed on South-South cooperation as a crucial pillar of the agenda. We should reinforce the argument that while South-South cooperation and the voluntary efforts of developing countries such as India would continue to play an important role, it would be a travesty to project them as the principal new component of a redefined global partnership for the new agenda. South-South cooperation has to be accompanied by a significant enhancement of North-South aid flows, not their diminution. In this context, we were somewhat disappointed with the content of the recently released Bali communique of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the post-2015 development agenda. It is surprising that even as the crucial importance of ODA for many developing countries is being reiterated at various high-level fora, this document does not contain a single mention of ODA. We need to register the note of caution that if recommendations of the panel are to make a meaningful contribution to evolving a new development agenda, they should reflect in equal measure the concerns of both the developing and the developed world. We should be careful not to dissipate the political consensus reached in the Rio +20 outcome. The fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness at Busan in 2011 encouraged increased efforts to support effective development cooperation and noted that South-South efforts would be accommodated within the envisaged global partnership for effective development cooperation, but on a voluntary basis. Without doubt, there is scope for an exchange of learning between the North-South and South-South models. There are concepts and practices that the South can absorb from the North-South engagement. Equally, the North can draw from the outlook and methodology that the South applies to its development partnerships. A sustainable global partnership on development cooperation can only be built from a harmonious synthesis of both models. There is an apprehension in some quarters that efforts to establish a global partnership are being directed at centralizing the monitoring and evaluation of development assistance flows and encouraging their convergence at the recipient level. If this is pursued in a clinical manner, such an approach would dilute the richness and diversity of development experience sharing between developing countries. We therefore need an informed debate on this aspect. I believe that more regular and sustained interactions among the countries of the South will facilitate a crystallization of their approach to all these aspects of the global development cooperation debate. A culture of consultations and more effective experience sharing between our development cooperation institutions will enhance our ability to feed Southern perspectives more effectively into the global dialogue. I'm sure that this conference will make a valuable contribution to this process. We have a broad spectrum of Southern partners, not providers, and recipients of development assistance, and the very welcome involvement of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the level of Under Secretary General Wu Hongbo. I hope this conference will address these issues in depth and emerge with some consensus on the major preoccupations of developing countries in the emerging global development environment. I wish you all success in this endeavor. Thank you.